Jonathan Landgrebe is a German economist and publisher. He studied in Göttingen, Lyon, Berkeley, and Munich. He joined Suhrkamp Verlag. In 2007, he took over the chair of Suhrkamp and the post of director of the publishing house in 2015. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
So, what school did you go to in Göttingen?
Oh, I actually went to the Göttingen University and did my basically what in Great Britain or United States would be bachelor part of economical studies.
Okay.
Yeah, and that is a very old traditional German university city, quite small. So after a certain time, I left.
But you had a pretty rich experience there.
In Göttingen, Göttingen is one of these places where students who look for a place to study go to in Germany, and it's a beautiful little town. I was actually quite focused on getting through with my studies, so I spent there 1.5 years.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So does every publisher in Germany have to be very well educated?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think there's any kind of rules, are there? And I think the question of what one has to bring to publish books or to be a publisher, however you see it, there is no rule. And I personally am convinced that there's many paths to do it. And if you look historically, you can see that there's a lot of proof that any way is possible. Surely it helps to read a lot.
Yes.
Which is kind of linked to being educated. And
okay.
So...
Plus no one knows the secret of success, so how do you train for...
Exactly. I don't think you can train. I don't think you can make up rules. I would say no, there's no necessity to have done this or that.
It just happens that you did.
Well, I have always been immensely interested in books and literature, and I always found publishing an exciting thing to do based on what I could see while I grew up and in the environment of my family, and I always found that it's just one of the most exciting things to imagine being exposed to such a wide range of topics, of language, of reading. And so I did think about what I need to being able to do to being capable of publishing books. And of course there's a kind of a range of competencies that help. And what I then saw after I had studied and gotten my PhD is indeed, there are an amount of things that still up today help me to do what I'm doing.
Okay, so what's the most useful?
In publishing books, we have a strong basis which is important in literary studies, in knowing what you are talking about in what you are publishing. That's the one side of publishing. The other side is the economical, the business side of publishing, which is a kind of different field, one could think, but in a publishing house like Suhrkamp, it all comes together. We are independent. This publishing house has a tradition of being independently driven. There is no big corporation that takes over the business part of it, and you can just focus on doing every book. So it needs both. It needs the entrepreneurial part, it needs the business part, and it needs the literary part. And for me, what I studied, the big gain I got was on the side of economy and business, which wasn't on, I have to say, on my screen when I started studying. It was more like something, do I really need to know this? Do I really need to do this? And so for me, that was the big step in something I learned, and in the role I am in today, which is being the sole head of this publishing house, which in the end has 120 people publishing 400 books a year. I need both. I need the knowledge of what we are publishing. I need my enthusiasm for books, for literature, but I also need the business side, which is basically asking how do we get this done in a way that makes it sustainable and successful for everybody involved.
Okay, so how do you do that?
How do I do it? Well, that's a big question. It's, I think, mainly the publishing house lives off its authors and the people who do the publishing house, which in this case is a broad range of authors. That way we are so happy and proud to publish. Without them, nothing would ever work. And so everything we think here is driven by the question of what is good for the authors we are publishing, and what do we need to do to make their books visible and successful, and to make the authors more visible and successful and being understood. And from there, it is everybody who works here in the publishing house, from editing to production, that try to make this mission happen. And I'm in every step trying to be there to make this mission be fulfilled.
Okay, which brings us to, you'll have to help me with the pronunciation, it's Siegfried Unseld?
Siegfried Unseld.
Siegfried Unseld, who headed up this company for quite
many years,
a
nearly
few
50
years. And he wrote a book called The Author and His Publisher. So I want to riff off that a bit with you to try and get at what the role of the publisher is and how you can fill it successfully. He starts off, and this is sort of a book of speeches, and funnily enough, I used this approach with Stephen Page at Faber, with Jeffrey Faber, who has a book of speeches, or they are adapted from his speeches. So same thing here. Anyway, so Siegfried starts off with one of the signs of Napoleon's greatness, this is according to sociologists, is the fact that he once had a publisher shot. He then continues with a dramatist by the name of Hebel, saying it's easier to walk on the waters with Christ than to get along with a publisher. And then he finishes off with Max Frisch, a Swiss author, who said that the difference between an author and a horse is that the horse doesn't understand the horse dealer's language. So there is a tension between the publisher and the author built in.
Yeah, I think so. Siegfried Unseld, indeed, just to add a bit to the insight, he took over as a publisher from Peter Suhrkamp, who founded the publishing house right after the Second World War, and Siegfried Unseld stepped into the publishing house and took over after a couple of years. Right. And Peter Suhrkamp died about 10 years after the end of the Second World War.
This was after Fischer, right? There was some kind of...
Peter Suhrkamp, yes, he headed the Fischer publishing house, and in the times of war, because of the complications that were there for them as Jewish publishers to run the publishing house, he got through the Second World War with an immense effort, continued publishing, and after the war, then it went this way. He founded Suhrkamp. We had a couple of authors like Bertolt Brecht or Hermann Hesse, who were asked which publishing house they would want to join. Hermann Hesse, Bertolt Brecht wanted to publish with Peter Suhrkamp, and he could build up this publishing house. And it was at that time he started to publish Proust, and it had been the beginning, and there was a big part of the foundation laid that made this publishing house, which it is today. And then Siegfried Unseld really made it big, and with an immense sense of quality, of literary perspective, of making it the cultural institution in Germany to publish literature after the Second World War, and then to follow up with philosophy that started a couple of years later, and social sciences, to make it the publishing house that would, most of all German publishing houses, that a literary publishing house of a significant size being publishing the relevant literary and philosophical and social sciences books that have, one could say, shaped Germany in the second half of the 20th century.
And its independence.
And he succeeded in doing it independently, yes. So he succeeded in making it a cultural institution and at the same time being entrepreneurially successful. which up to today is what I want to succeed with, having both and being good in both and making this continue, which up to today is happening and successfully happening. And so this is why in the 70s an author of ours shaped the term of Suhrkamp culture, which has been like dominant in German cultural life and in German public life for a certain kind of understanding of literature and also developments in society and philosophy.
You're as good as it gets.
Suhrkamp definitely has in Germany a very outstanding position. And it is hard to do what Siegfried Unseld did. He did something absolutely extraordinary in the way he succeeded in building up this publishing house. He did something unique. There is not a comparable publishing house in Germany, and he was unique in this sense of being able to do it, but also unique in the way he handled his relationships with the authors. We published a lot of his letter exchanges. He was an intensive writer himself, in conversation with his authors, in conflict with his authors. His letter exchanges fill books, whether it may be with Peter Handke or with Thomas Bernhard and with many others. And he was not shy in also getting in conflict, but he was also, of course, because of his position, because of the position of the publishing house, the authors, of course, often felt that there's a very strong gatekeeper, the publishing house and its publisher, who have a significant say in what will happen to the books, to how the books are being seen in public, and eventually also with an impact on the life of the authors who would depend on what the publishing house does success. And out of this came his position and also his handling of it, and he has always been following up the mission, the idea that the author is bigger than the publishing house, more important, Turm hoch über dem, like in German put, like way above the publishing house and the publisher. And nevertheless, that doesn't stop to be in conflict in order to make things going the way the publishing house, the publisher believes it's right. And yeah, that can be a position of conflict. Absolutely not always. To be honest, I think every publisher and every editor also, despite all conflict in everyday work, I think one can say that in the very end one is not in conflict. No, one is working together on something. But of course, day by day, things come up.
Well, it's funny reading this book, and he does focus on Hermann Hesse and Brecht and Rilke. Loyalty was a key theme in this book, and it seems to me that literary agents have capitalized on this. They've gone to the author and said, listen, I'm here for your best interests. You need me to have a relationship with the publisher. They've stuck their nose in between and into that relationship.
So a publishing house like Suhrkamp traditionally has had in earlier times not had so productive cooperation with agents. This is a publishing house, which probably all the publishing houses in the world had, but particularly was angry at agents who stepped in and from our perspective messed things up. Mm-hmm. This is how one would have put it here 25 years ago. Why is that so? Because it was viewed from the perspective of the publishing house that basically their main aim would be to maximize short-term profits, to get as much money out of the publishing house as possible in the short run, to not look at the greater picture of what would happen in 5, 10, 20 or 30 years, and therefore not doing good on what the purpose of the publishing is. And we as a publishing house still have the position, we don't do one-time things. We want to publish authors. That's another quote. We publish authors, not books, which means if we take on a book, we think about the author and what will follow, or what perhaps even has been published already.
Well, you've done these beautiful complete series, for example, of Hesse and Brecht.
Not only of them. We have done a lot of complete works. That's perhaps something that today is not really something people want anymore, but always the perspective of a long-term relationship, of making in the long run an author successful, of going through the downs and the ups and sticking on because of our decision to believing in the quality of the writing and the quality of the thought of the author we publish. Mm-hmm. And that is not always in line with the wish, neither, of course, of the agent and also not of authors to optimize money on the short run. And we go through the bad times, so perhaps therefore we are a bit more conservative in saying, and now for this one book. So, and the thinking of agents has often been a bit more, let's just make sure the maximum of money that we can get, we auction a book. And we wouldn't even be happy with auctionings of books because we think an author who started to publish with one publishing house should stick to it. It's way easier to build up a reputation, to have a continuous process of editorial but also marketing work, and it's doing better to build something up in the long run. So this is where it all comes from. And so yes, it's true that literary agents were felt as a kind of problem, and not even a productive problem, and not even necessarily good for the authors. That has been the position of this publishing house. I have to at the same time say that today the situation is different. Literary agents are present, they are very present, and many of them do very good work and have also the capacity to think long-termischer. So we also adapted over time, and today have a productive working relationship with many agents, just as many other publishing houses.
Although if the idea is to grow with the author over a long period of time, that agent is always going to be bugging you for more money, though.
There is different agents, and there are agents who pretty much know what publishing is about and who understand the value of long-term relationships and to stick to it. And it's not even, I think one is surprised sometimes from which agents, which publicly might have a different image, suddenly come signaled that they absolutely get the value of long-term relationships and really try to come to solutions. And there are other agents who really are more running for the next big amount of money, which then indeed might probably not be the agents we more regularly work with. Yeah.
Okay. It's interesting, in France they still really don't like the agents so much.
It's also now changing in France. Yeah. We still do a lot of contracts directly with the authors, and we are convinced and absolutely doing our best that these authors are also in terms of money treated absolutely equal to authors who come via agents. But it's also hard if an author says, I just feel better that my financial position is being taken care of and I just need this to feel safe and secure. We accept it. It's okay.
Well, and I'll call him Siegfried with no disrespect intended. Here he says, today the image of a publisher is automatically associated with such labels as rich, elitist, conservative, authoritarian. He is accused of practicing censorship and of being a capitalist exploiter and profiteer.
Yeah.
He's saying...
Okay, this book has been published like in the 70s.
Yes, but aren't these the conglomerates, you can still call them capitalist exploiters and profiteers. You can very easily call them that.
That is true, but I would still insist that like the publishing house at Suhrkamp, we are a big of the small publishing houses, and if one would call us big, we are surely one of the smallest of the big. And I have some doubts what he is describing there would now apply to these independent publishing houses. Like, we are one of them, but it's absolutely true on the other hand that there's still, corporate publishing is still big business, big money, and could be here and there seen as the way he's describing it.
Okay. Now I'm just going to lay a few more quotes on you and I can get your feedback if I could. But because we do affirm our society Because we do want to encourage its possibilities and its chances for reform and progress, we must publish books in which progressive theories are disseminated so that they can be discussed.
Absolutely true. At the time he was saying, writing it, and still true today. And this is still true for our program. As I described before, we are on the one side a literary publishing house with a very strong list of German literature and international literature from other languages in translation. On the other hand, we are publishing the Edition Suhrkamp, which is a line of books coming from the social sciences would fit exactly what you are describing there, and which has been a flagship of what Suhrkamp is, just as we are publishing our philosophical program with thoughts that have the potential to change society, which have to be discussed. And it's definitely, of course, a mission to publish what can change society there where things need to change.
Which typically means more money to the poor and more equality.
That definitely is a very important thought. I think it's today not the only thought anymore. We are now starting to be in topics like climate change, etc. But inequality has always been an important, very important part of what we are publishing about.
The desire for change is the impetus behind all great literature. Its intention is to make readers stronger by making them uneasy. It tells what was, what is, but also what will be and what ought to be.
Yeah, and I would add, it also tells what could be, like in the sense that it opens up horizons to hypothetical and scenarios that one hasn't thought about and that only literature can provide. And it's by widening the horizon through literature, but that can also just as well be true for non-fiction, for potentials, for other worlds. That is the start to being able to think different conditions, different societies, a different life.
He then refers to Wilhelm Friedrich. He was a publisher who actually failed. The career of the Leipzig publisher Friedrich, who has been the first one to lend vital support to the growth of the modern movement, was destroyed by his modern authors. For the book-buying public had, as always, lagged many a year behind the new literary figures and did not want to understand them or buy them. In the place of Friedrich Verlag, however, Berlin's Fischer Verlag, S. Fischer, blossomed for all of Germany. So he was too far ahead of himself.
I think that discussion is absolutely important for looking at the works of authors. One can transfer it to discussing publishing houses as a whole, but in the first place we are talking about the very frequent occurrence that books are being written or published at a time where they didn't get the resonance they would have deserved. And this is exactly why we find it so important here to stick with authors and to not judging what happens on the success or missuccess of a single book, because these things are relative and they can change over years. And our idea of publishing is to build an opinion of what we think an author can do and write and what the book is, and not be totally depending on its market success. There is great pieces of literature, and not only literature, also of philosophy and non-fiction that just don't sell, or that people even hate or are not treating with respect. That doesn't change that there still can be a very important piece of literature which deserves to be published.
And very important down the road.
And very important down the road and being recognized much later. So here the idea is to stick to one's own beliefs and opinions and not to the market success, which we are very happy with, and we work for market success, and we wish that it works, and we hope to make money for the author, also for the publishing house, but it's not the criteria that all our thinking goes.
So what is the criteria then? Like what, this is
what you have already mentioned in the sense. It's literary quality, it's quality of speech, it's thoughts that we believe are worthwhile following, that can change the world, and all this is not always linked to market success.
That's the $1 million question, is how do you find that? How do you identify that? And the only answer I've gotten is, it makes the hairs on my arms stand up, it's an instinct, it's like, there hasn't been a very good answer. And I guess if there was a good answer,
everybody would follow.
Yeah.
I think perhaps one can make it easy. I think everybody has reading experiences, and there's books that for readers mean a lot, and others that mean less. And in a very simple sense, a publishing house, a publisher, but also everybody who is reading, the editors, they live off the same experience, just based perhaps in comparison to normal readers, based on perhaps a wider reader experience, so that their judgment comes from just much more having read. But the effect, and that you cannot really generalize, just as you cannot for a single reader, that something is just absolutely convincing you, and that you think from an intellectual, from a literary, from an emotional perspective, you have found the book that you just believe is the book. That is where it starts. And then it's the challenge and the task to explain and transfer this feeling and knowledge to others. And a publishing house, a publisher, nor the editors do mistakes. There's also mistakes, there's also wrong judgments, perhaps even one could say.
Most of the time, you could say.
Yeah, where it didn't live up to what one thought is in there.
That would be also the individual themselves, wouldn't it? They don't mature the way you think they might. Their thinking might not.
That could well be, or it's even there, it's not so uncomparable to the reading experience of an individual who reads a book and thinks this is the greatest I've ever read, and tries to explain to the friends why this is so great. And everybody's like, no, I'm sorry, I cannot bond with this book, etc. And we are in a very similar constellation where, based on our experience and knowledge and reading, we are just convinced of something we get in our hands and think everybody should read it, everybody should know these thoughts, and that is where it starts. And to transfer this enthusiasm to others.
Okay. The poet does not write in order to fulfill the needs of the public. The more personal, the way in which he expresses his nature, the more difficult it will be for him to make himself clearly understood. The publisher's most important and beautiful mission is to force upon the public new values it doesn't want.
That is what I've just described. We see it as our mission and challenge to convey to people the value and worthiness of something they perhaps wouldn't have gotten themselves, that it was so. And the bigger the challenge, the more we feel challenged and try to succeed in doing so, and bridging the gap between upfront knowledge, that's what I want, and what we believe should be recognized. I give you an example here, which is very, very, in these years, with the outbreak of the Ukraine war, suddenly the global public, but also the German public, looked at literature from the Ukraine, which we have been publishing for years and years and years. Right. And also not only in translation, we have been taking over world rights for Ukrainian authors, because we noticed they would get no step into the global market. It's no problem to say that these books were very hard to sell, and we have for many years, really after long processes of talking and conviction, if we sold 2,000 or 3,000 copies, we had to be happy. And now suddenly comes this war in the Ukraine, and public attention switches, and these authors now get what we have believed for the last 25 years they should have gotten in attention. Now Jerzy Jardin won the German prize, the Friedensbuchpreis, an important prize that makes his works more recognizable. We sell a lot of translations globally, and it's an example for
Is this just because of the commencement of the war?
The commencement of the war made public attention switch to it.
Yeah.
And now people suddenly see, oh, this is great literature, which it is.
Which is kind of a sad irony, isn't it?
Yeah, of course, it's sad irony, but it shows you that the work of the last 25 years, where the public recognition wasn't there, wasn't worthless. The value was there. It was good to do it. We sometimes were frustrated that the success wasn't there, but we kept on. And now you have an occasion where people look a bit more closely, and a bigger amount of people looks, and they start to recognize, oh, actually, we have misjudged there, and we should have read more of this earlier.
And isn't it so much about attention? It's so much about, we know this is really important and good work. Just how do we get people just to read it so that that's all they have to do? Because it'll sell itself.
No, absolutely. The question of how to create attention for an author and for a book is the big question, and it has changed a lot through the internet, digitization, and social media.
Yeah. So Hugo Ball, Hermann Hesse's biographer, defined the possibilities and function of the publisher who, quote, lends the work reality and a social stamp even before it has been written, and who can give an author that sense of meaningfulness in his actions and that abundance of expectation without which his work might not come into being.
Yeah, of course, as a publisher and as a publishing house, we are the first ones who kind of give the author, even if the book hasn't been written yet, or if it's in the process of being written, an idea of what the resonance room will be in which the author publishes. And that, of course, can be not only a big motivation, but it can also be a bounce ball for knowing what one is doing. I think there's a limit to this kind of pre-recognition of what has been written and published, and I think it can also be dangerous in the sense that it drives an author off a path that he or she wishes to follow and should follow. So I think one has to keep a balance in how strongly one tries to preempt what will later happen with the book in conversation with an author.
Okay. This is what Suhrkamp thought. He thought, I want you to remember one thing, he said to some colleagues. Every author, no matter how young he is, in his capacity as a creative personality, towers above the three of us sitting here.
Yeah, that is the one important quote that we always repeat here to ourselves. That is our perspective on publishing. The author is way above us all, and that is important to recognize so that one doesn't start to believe the publishing is more important than the author, or even worse, the business is more important than the author, or something like that.
Yeah, it's the good author, though. It's the really, really good author. You don't give that kind of respect to just any author.
Well, we are talking here of our authors.
Right, but again, how does an author who's working away become one of your authors?
I mean, we talked about it. To become an author of this publishing house, we do have a quite strong and strict selection on how we choose, by reading, by discussing. It's never only one person who reads. It's a process of becoming an author of this publishing house, and also probably without being able to formalize that, but of course it's also not only about writing one book or a book, but to be an author in this publishing house is also a process over time, with the first and the second and the third book. And yes, you get more, there is a process of getting more attached.
So you're assessing that personality, isn't it? You're assessing that human being as much as what they've written on the page.
We are assessing if we are then only through what the human being has been writing. So we judge from what has been written. One can do a lot from just thorough reading.
Okay, so who's the most exciting example that you can pick over the last 10 years? And tell me why.
There's of course a great range of authors that we publish very happily and proudly. And it's one rule, if we are sitting here quoting Siegfried Unseld all the time, he would have never.
It's in the book.
He would have never.
It's in the book.
It's in the book. That's why I'm saying he would have never answered that question.
That's why I asked.
So it's easy for me to. It's easy for me to.
I know, but it's not good enough. That's not good enough. I want a specific. Let's just say.
It's very easy to pass this question back to you.
No, I know that. I can just like one. I can say, recommend to me as a non-German reader. And
as
then why?
As a non-German reader, I can give you two examples which I find great, which are also non-German. The one is which I'm very proud and I find a real success story, and it deserves success story. It's the author Rachel Cusk, who's British, who hadn't had awareness in Germany, and whom we started to publish a couple of years ago, and were so convinced of the style of her writing, of what she already had published and what was presented to us as her new books, that we thought this is a mission for us. We want to make her known as a writer here in the German-speaking countries. And we started off with that, and I can say that today she has a public awareness we wanted her to have, and many of her books before weren't translated and not published, and this worked out, and it spilled over also to the works she had already written. But
what makes it so good? I've read one of her books. I thought it was okay.
She's a brilliant thinker. She is a brilliant stylist. She has a beautiful language linked with very strong analytical skills and a strong sense of today's societies and their conditions. Whether it's her books on marriage and divorce, whether it's the newer books, I think there's a path of just an immensely talented writer who.
But Faber had already done that job for you. You just said, okay, we agree. She'll work here.
I'm saying this is now foreign language. They did the job successfully. She did the job successfully in the English-speaking countries, but it didn't get any recognition in the German-speaking countries. Our job in this case is to make an international author known in Germany.
What about a German?
If you look at the path of, and I'm coming back to, if you look at the path of German-speaking authors, take an author like Lutz Seiler, who started with Suhrkamp as writing poetry. And for many, many years, he has been an author of ours for more than nearly 30 years. And it took until about 5 years ago that he won the German Book Prize for a novel he wrote. And
which one?
And before that, he was a successful author as a poet. And the book he won the prize with was called Crusoe. It was a piece on the DDR. He followed up with another novel, Stern 111, which again told a part of the history of the former DDR and the times after the fall of the wall here in Berlin and Germany. Mm-hmm. And these are examples of authors where we just kept on publishing. It was not necessarily big market successes, but he's just a wonderful writer. He's so knowledgeable. He's so good in what he sees and how and what he describes, and he succeeded in making out of his capacities as somebody who writes poetry up to now 2 wonderful novels, and I'm sure they will continue. And I can tell you, while he is now also not of the younger generation, but in the younger generation we are following up. That sometimes takes time. It's not something everybody sees immediately. But I'm absolutely convinced, peu à peu, these authors we are working with that publish now, some more, some with a little bit less success. It doesn't matter. It'll come by time, and the talent will be coming through at a certain point.
These are translated in English, the books you're saying?
Yes, Lutz Seiler is translated in English. Yeah.
And how do you spell that again?
It's Lutz, and then it's Seiler.
You see, again, just showing my ignorance.
Well,
I'd never heard of him, and he's like a big deal here.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's another topic in itself, the differences of publishing in every country, and this is why also one shouldn't judge little when we talked about somebody like Rachel Cusk, or like, by the way, somebody like Annie Ernaux is a similar example, whom we've built up here after she hadn't been known in Germany, French great writer. It is its own thing to make somebody known in a certain language field, and it's not that publishing is like global business like the big groups would see it. It's always like something that is known all over the planet. No, 95% of publishing is author by author, book by book, country by country, or rather language by language. And this is 95%. And this idea of global publishing, etc., yeah, that might be true for Rowling or something, but not for 95% of what we love and are enthusiastic for. It doesn't just travel like this into different languages and countries. This is work. And Suhrkamp, by the way, has been putting a lot of effort and is very known for fighting for translations for their authors in other countries, which is not something one should take for granted. For the Anglo-American countries, it's one could say a business to sell rights to a market like Germany, which is big. But for German literature to travel abroad, that's a harder job to do, and we've done a lot because we are so convinced that every language has to be convinced, and books need to travel. And that's one could have another conversation on just this field of making literature travel languages, which is then taking the translators into perspective and the different cultures of different countries.
This just brings up what we were talking about outside. I do want to get that on the record. The fact that I am blown away by this wonderful English language section at Dussmann bookstore in Berlin here. You're telling me that some of the Rachel Cusk, for example, sells just as well in Germany in English as she does in German, and that's a growing...
Yeah, that I find a very interesting field. I think the developments of the recent years and the increasing globalization, and simply the fact that particularly in Germany people are just fluent in English. Many people are fluent in English whether they are German or not. So we have seen an immense increase in book sales in original language. In non-fiction anyway, in academic, it's an old phenomenon. It's now in popular non-fiction, and it's now very strong even in literature. So there's a quite high number of authors, not all of them, who are simply read in English. And that of course changes a bit the perspectives of the German publishing houses, because if 50% of what is being sold is already being sold in English language, then it becomes, and that is then purely a matter of calculation. It becomes more difficult to calculate a German translation because one has to calculate with much less readership than one would before.
Yes. So in other words, you would not be willing to pay as much for the German language rights.
If such a trend continues in all fields, yes, I think that will make the advances go down for the German language rights, definitely. There's little doubt that. I still see a positive effect. Culturally, it's of course great. People read original. It can also help the marketing. We have now the phenomenon that in German newspapers, English books are reviewed, which we didn't have 5 or 10 years ago. So they pick up already the English language publication and write about it. So there is also advantages about it, but overall, I think if this trend continues in this intensity, it'll make the advances go down. Yeah.
Just following up on it, the magic, the secret, the age-old publishing secret. This is how Siegfried Unseld frames this. He says that the mixture, the combination, the blend of young and old authors, of saleable books and those with little or no saleability, of authors who follow the political currents of the day, and those who fanatically follow only the demands of their own work. The goal of the publisher is not to make a hodgepodge out of such a mixture, but to create a synthesis out of the disparate parts, to form a unity, a single program, a totality out of what is nearly irreconcilable. This constitutes the publisher's task and results in that special stamp that Hugo Ball was referring to when he spoke of S. Fisher. And then just to follow up on that, a literary publisher who is serious about his responsibilities will never, not even in hard times, stop publishing the latest literature, no matter how difficult it is to find buyers and readers for it. Young and new, as well as older and passé, authors always, quote, live to a certain extent off those who are at the peak of their potentiality and popularity.
There's a lot in what he writes there. Surely if one talks about the publishing house as a whole, it's absolutely, and there's nothing has changed. You have authors who at a certain point in time are at the maximum potential of how books sell, and that gives money. If you look at it from a historical perspective, that is basically financing the past and the present and the future of other authors, perhaps for a moment, and then it changes again. And we have continuously the challenge to, as a publishing house, to curate a program, to create a program that makes all these, not only from the side of what we are publishing, what is being written, and what are the topics that are being written about, in what language and for what audience, but also to make it, to give it a kind of overall picture that also functions from a market side and from the business perspective, to make sure that the publishing house sells the amount of books it wants to sell. And so it's a wide portfolio of challenges that one has to get into one pot, into a program that fulfills all these needs.
You've got these brilliant writers, but some of them are, you then have to sort of, on top of that, prognosticate on how much of that are we going to sell. Like, should we re-release certain authors now? Or
and I think what I feel has gotten much stronger since we have now the social media, the digitization. Many things are very strongly driven really now by single books and authors. So for a publishing house like Suhrkamp, I would say 25 years ago, it was a bit easier to say, look what we are publishing, rely on us and buy what we are publishing.
Yeah.
Whereas the process of social media and digitization has brought a situation where people are where the forces come into like very erratically and not so easily calculable on a single book, on a certain author, in a certain wave. And all these forces to then in the end still say, as a publishing house, this is what we do, here's the amount of books, look at the whole thing. There's a kind of constant challenge to bring all these drives and market forces and attention forces, one could say, from social media in harmony with the publishing house and its program and the composition of it.
Like, do you do centenaries, for example? You look at that and say, okay, we should do Brecht, we should do some newly designed versions of this and that. The other thing, too, is he still in copyright, or can anyone publish him now?
Whom?
Well, I'm thinking of Hesse and Brecht.
No. Hesse and Brecht are still protected for a couple of years. We have more than 10,000 titles deliverable as a publishing house. And so the backlist is a big part of what we are doing, and to taking care of it and to notice when it's necessary to republish something, to make people again aware of it, to find new ways of doing that is a constant part of what we do. So it's not only about the new books, it's all the time also about 10,000 books and more that we have already published, to look at them and think, well, is there an opportunity to make people again aware of them?
But if they're running out in the next few years, do you want to get them out, sooner than later? New versions of.
We do. When I think every publisher in the meantime, when they have an author whose copyright runs out, try to make editions in the end that kind of stand for themselves and a bit protect the market. And particularly with authors like Hermann Hesse or Bertolt Brecht, Bertolt Brecht is still like 4 or 5 years. Hesse is more than 10 years still to go, but we have such a wide range of books, and we have done such a tremendous amount of work on these books that we will remain the publishing house that is publishing the relevant versions of these books that people hopefully buy.
With critical commentary too, right?
Partly, exactly.
Yeah. So would you say that these authors are the reason why you're able to be independent? Because of the money that you've made off them?
Hermann Hesse surely is an important, not only for the identity of the publishing house, but also on the economic side, absolutely important for the publishing house. I think from today's perspective, we will and remain an independent publishing house, whether these authors are on copyright or not.
Yes.
But it is true. Yeah, they build a significant part of our book sales, and it is one of the tasks we have to get to terms with to get these book sales from elsewhere. But that not only has to do with running out of copyright. I think it's also the beauty of what we are doing, that one cannot rely forever on something, but it's about finding new voices, finding new authors, finding new literature, making the next generation successful. I'm proud and happy to publish Hermann Hesse, just as Bertolt Brecht or Max Frisch, but also I think a publishing house and all the young persons who are working here, including myself, if I still regard myself as young, we are so happy also to just do the next step and to find new authors, and we want to make them successful. So
that's what keeps you going.
That's what keeps us going, and to rely on the sales of an author who is great, but at a certain point, I think new voices and new successes are what gets us going.
Yeah. Just winding down here. What you want is Andrew Lloyd Webber to do a Brecht play or something, right? That would be good.
What a question. At the moment, we have a fantastic Barry Kosky, an Australian-born director who has been working at the Komische Oper in Berlin with tremendous success. He has been doing a new three-penny opera show at the Berliner Ensemble, which I find amazingly well done, with great success. And I think one doesn't need Andrew Lloyd Webber necessarily to have a big success.
That's my favorite reference there. And Cats, of course. I mean, but it's kept them in business and kept them independent. Thankfully, that was the angle. I
didn't even know.
If they didn't have that, I don't believe they'd be able to be independent anymore.
We are building here on a very broad range of titles, and on a very diverse program as us keep going.
This is interesting. Siegfried says, The author centers his confidence in the person who respects creativity, but who also knows that a source of that creativity often lies in illness, in neuroses.
Can be, absolutely. I think there's no doubt that outstanding events in one's own life have a very strong effect on one's creativity and also on one's ability or one's writing. And so to deal with difficult circumstances, whether they are neurotic, internal or external, is part of what every author witnesses, and it's our task as a publisher to help authors to, despite these situations, which can sometimes be difficult for their everyday work, to help them make them productive for their work, because that is where they are heading for, and that can comprise all that, absolutely, and it often does indeed.
Well, and it's, this idea that, yes, I'm the publisher, I'm going to give you a monthly amount of money just so you don't have to worry about that. Their mental health, not having to worry about poverty.
Absolutely. When you talk about where publishing comes from, or if you talk about the German word, also Verleger, of course, you're talking about money and you're talking about reliability. This is why publishing houses give money so that authors can work calmly and not need to worry.
Yeah.
And they give it in advance.
This is what the publisher's responsibility involves, to instill courage, to set energies in motion.
Yeah. Enthusiasm is what drives me, what drives everybody who works here, and enthusiasm is energy, and we want everybody to be as enthusiastic as we are about the books we are publishing. So that's what it's all about.
The publisher is not so intent on satisfying needs with his books. What he wants is to awaken new needs for his books.
Which leads back to the question of, do I publish what the market wants, or do I convince the market of the books I publish? And I think we are in quick agreement here that while it's sometimes it can be satisfying to simply be in the right moment, in the right spot with the right book to fulfill something the market wants, it is much more satisfying and fulfilling if one shows people that they would have missed something enormously if they wouldn't have let themselves be convinced by a great book we publish or published.
The main thing is that the publisher must be thinking continually and creatively about his firm. He must think for others. His innovative powers constantly prepare him for what is new. On the other hand, he remains faithful to tradition. We sort of touched on that, didn't we?
We have touched on that. We talked about Hesse and New Voices. I think here, as a publishing house like Suhrkamp, we are very faithful to our tradition on the one side, but it is my personal perspective that one also has to be playful and happy and courageous enough to also do steps out, to never work against, based on the tradition, to enjoy the liberties and freedom of where one is today and make the most out of that just as well.
I like to publish books that have some impact. And in this connection, I must always think of Kafka's words: a book must be the axe for the frozen sea within it. Is there a frozen sea within you?
I still find that a very beautiful quote, and I think every single book can do that, and every single book should do it. And every book perhaps does it for somebody else. It's not readers are the diversity of readers that are, but if a book succeeds in doing that for a single reader, that's already very, very, very much.
Yeah. The publisher wants to bring out literature that penetrates the reader's consciousness and attempts to alter it. literature which provides readers with substance at the same time that it disquiets them.
Yeah, it's another beautiful way of making obvious how much literature can change in a person, in thinking, in the perspectives one is capable of taking, and eventually away from the individual be the basis of change in society.
Okay, I'll stop quoting him now just with this one here. Today, this is Siegfried Unseld. Today, I am a publisher attempting to produce books of literary quality and substance, books in which an individual can find himself and which at the same time further an interest in a rational society. Since this is what I'm trying to do, it is my wish that a new reader be convinced, first of all, of the author's importance, of what the author can mean to him.
That is, again, saying that when we publish books and we create, and we as a publishing house are seen as an institution that tries to make a maximum of people aware of books and try to sell as many books as possible, which definitely is an aim of what we do. This is another quote that for me basically makes so obvious that it is in the end the single reader that counts, just as the author counts more than the publishing house. I would also say that as a publisher, while we want to sell many books, we should be more happy about what a single book and a single reader can do with the reader than the happiness we feel by having high quantities of books. And I think to just focus on this and to see that there's one author who's in the very end, we are just in between, there's one author who in a very, very beautiful way builds a connection to one reader, and the one book he's or she has been written can change so much in a single reader. And if we have this single reader, then that is the basis for everything. And the rest is numbers, figures, and of course success and more readers, which is great. But to have this, if I see that the book can do this with one reader and nothing else we do when manuscripts come into the publishing house and one first reader is convinced, whether it be me or one of the editors, then that is where it all starts. And one is convinced by the quality of a manuscript, it changes something in oneself.
What would that change? Like, it would change you because of what, a whole range of different reasons, or?
I think it has changed for a whole range of reasons. It changes your emotions, it changes your perspective on life, it makes you realize things, it gives you the opportunity to mirror things, gives you the way to learn about the world through the lens of the author, through the lens of the protagonists or the personalities of the book. And if you have this in a single book with a single reader, that is where the journey starts to thinking about publishing.
And the goal ultimately is to change these readers so they become better people, and so that society becomes better and peaceful.
I wouldn't put it so normative. I think that the openness for literature and the openness for different perspectives that are being transferred through literature are giving an opportunity to change, and yes, ultimately, hopefully, from its individual perspective, to enrich one's own life, which in the best case also adds to wishing to make not only one's own life, but everybody else's life a better life, and society a better place.
Okay, final question. Difference between you operating here in Berlin and someone operating in New York. What's the difference?
First of all, there's such a wide range of differences, but there's also so much one has in common that would start a real new conversation. We deal with German language here, in as a very big part of what we are doing. Not everything, as we discussed before, and so there is still, despite all globalization, big differences in cultures, in language, in traditions, and these different cultures, traditions, and languages that, of course, make what we do different, including the readership we sell books to, and the mechanisms that we use to do. On the other hand, there are many of the functionings of this industry that are very similar. Indeed, I think still Germany in publishing is a little bit less, I would say, we are not as much as in the United States. You were asking for New York, big money driven.
I've noticed that.
It's a bit more. It's still more. I would say.
It's still more wonderful.
Seriously focusing on the literature and the authors. It's a bit, perhaps even a bit friendlier, in that sense that it's not always about money all the time. And there's a huge recognition in the German language field for the cultural value of literature and for the publishing houses to do it. And we try to live up to these expectations, to not only be the businesses which the one or the other publishing house in New York City might be regarded, but to we feel we have a cultural mission. We are important for culture, for thinking, for development in society, and the publishing houses have a duty to do the right thing with regard to society, and society has a awareness of that, just as our authors, and I think that might still be a bit more developed here than in the United States. But it's different country by country.
If you wanted me to change my life by reading a Suhrkamp book, in English, unfortunately, what book would you put in my hand?
Give me a moment.
And I'll go get it, and I'll read it, and I'll report back to you to see how it's changed my life.
The one book which I would recommend, you can see here on the left. If you haven't read it yet, read Didier Eribon's Return to Reims. It has been translated, I'm pretty sure, so I can recommend it to you, hoping that you can get it in English language. This is a great report, an autobiographically shaped report on his life from a working community in France to his later life in Paris as an academic, and showing how inequality and discrimination and the thinking between left and right in France, in that case, has changed over the last 50 years. It's an impressive piece of work, and which we succeeded in making in Germany a big success, which is widely quoted. And then, on the other hand, I think you should. Let me see here. Can recommend this to you. This is a book by Sasha Marianna Salzmann. This is her second novel, which has been out not so long ago. And I could and would recommend to you to start with her first novel, which in German is called Außer sich, which should be out already in English. If not, you wait a couple of months. Young writer with a migrational background who writes about her story of Jewish Russian background coming here to Germany, and who is a great author to read.
That's great. Well, thanks for, I don't know if I'll have to think a minute to see if it's changed my life to meet you, but of course it has. So thank you for taking the time to riff off this book by Siegfried Unseld with me and to talk about Suhrkamp. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Jonathan Landgrebe is the publisher of Suhrkamp Verlag in Berlin. Thanks again.